Hello and welcome to another edition of the ICM Roundtable Meetings. We're joined by two of my fellow board members today. I'll get them to introduce themselves in a moment. But first off, so for those of you who don't know me, my name's Andy Baker. I'm the Managing Director and Head Trainer of Able Training Support Limited. And we predominantly focus in teaching, behaviour management and restraint within the health and social care sector. And I'm also the host of the Able to Care podcast as well, which is why I think they put me to kind of talk first, so to introduce everybody. So first off, I'll introduce Gerard, who was on the first episode as well. So welcome, Gerard.
Hi, everybody. Gerard O'Dea here. I'm the Managing Director of Team Dynamics Limited. We provide conflict management and physical interventions training in many different environments, but we do an awful lot of work in schools. And I'm looking forward to digging into this particular topic with you, Andy and Bernard.
Excellent. And Bernard.
Hi, I'm Bernard Allen. I was a head teacher for many years in the 90s and 2000s. I work as an expert witness now and often involved in investigations like we've seen recently involving undercover reporting too.
Yeah, fantastic. I know, Gerard, obviously you're not in the country at the moment. You're calling in from abroad. Whereabouts are you at the moment?
That's right. I'm in beautiful Trinidad, so Trinidad and Tobago. We're here working for the Ministry of Health, doing a project that has to do with improving outcomes when people in the community have a mental health crisis and they interact with staff from the prisons or the police or the healthcare services. And it's been lovely. We just had Hurricane Beryl, I think it was, that passed us by. Very luckily, when Alex and I arrived last Sunday, everybody looked very nervous, and we were like the two new guys going, why is everybody looking nervous? But luckily it passed us by, although there were tragic events, I think, all through the Caribbean last week. And yet they say God is a Trini, apparently, because the storms tend to pass Trinidad by. So I'm learning lots here.
Yeah, so spirits are high over there, but I'm sure imagine there's some worry in the area, or has been. So,
that's right.
Well, thank you very much. Because I know it's about 6 a.m. where you are, isn't it? So thank you for joining us from where you are. So we thought we'd do our second roundtable episode, although this has been a few weeks gone by now. Because we all work within the school sector and education sector, we all have watched the Panorama programme called Undercover Schools, Cruelty in the Classroom, that was released on the 17th of June 2024. And all of us felt it was a really good talking point to talk about predominantly around the culture of the organisation and what was going on within it. So to start off, whoever would like to go first, as far as what were the opinions of the programme, and let's jump into it a little bit.
Pretty shocking, wasn't it, to watch people who are looking after some of our most vulnerable children, who've already perhaps had really bad experiences in their short lives up to now, and the staff looking after them behaving in if we could just to start off with call it unprofessional ways, in how they speak about the people in their care, about how they behave with them, and then some of the awful physical abuse that they were carrying out. It was just shocking, and I know that lots of our colleagues around the sector who teach conflict management or physical interventions, we know that people look in our direction when the Panorama expose hits the broadcasting waves, but there's quite deep issues involved there, and I guess we'll dig into that. Bernard's seen a lot of it, though, so I think perhaps we could ask Bernard to give us a history of these kinds of issues. I mean, if you hold your breath long enough, there'll be another Panorama soon, unfortunately.
I think there already has been, isn't there? Somebody said there was another one that's come out about a different industry, but I haven't hunted that one down yet. But so tell us your perception of this, Bernard.
I think it's important to distinguish between physical restraint and abuse, and this has been a long pattern, and the danger is to conflate the two. Like when Christine Lenihan said, you've got to question why these people are working in this field. And it was clear from that programme that from the very top, the message was about becoming a 100 billion company with 100 schools, and the head teacher was going to be the most ambitious head teacher in the country. There was no mention of wanting to be the best provision for these kids or what they were going to do that would change these young people's lives. that sort of abuse does sometimes get confused, and you get simplistic answers, which is, well, just take all the powers away from the staff who run these places to stop them being able to do this. And that's been tried many times over the years, and it tends to go wrong. And I'm just hoping that we can use this as an opportunity to really examine what's happened here. Because like Winterbourne View, another scandal in social care, that was nothing to do with restraint. I didn't see any examples of any physical restraint techniques I've seen in either of those programs. I did see examples of YouTube chokeholds and play fighting and wrestling. And I think when Gerard talks about the culture, what happens often when there isn't strong leadership from the top is that we revert to the staff join in the sort of dominance subservience games that all primates indulge in, and they play by their rules. And I think that's what we saw in that. If I go back right to 1993, there was a Panorama expose similar to this one at Aycliffe Secure School. And I remember there was a young girl called Angela Wrighton there who talked about the culture, and it was identical. The culture was that they were big and tended to be males at the time. There was a big bloke who used to belly bash them to deck them, and she talked about being decked on into the lawn. And we talk about the fact that we keep repeating this cycle. Angela Wrighton, the young girl, and I've got the interviews with her. I came across her again in 2016 when I was asked to get involved in an investigation after another Panorama program in the youth justice system. That was because two youngsters coming into a youth training centre there as 13 and 14-year-olds were in there for the murder of a vulnerable woman in Darley and Hartlepool, and that was Angela Wrighton. So the circle had come right the way around. And I think the key is, as you've said, this is about cultures, and it's all the way through. And the different we had children's homes and social care homes in the 1990s with McIntyre Uncovered, with undercover reporters. There was a case at Cedar Vale Hospital where a patient died. With Winterbourne View too, all of these places had training that had supposedly been accredited. But the point was no one used it because there'd been the culture developed that seemed to be that everyone accepted that what was said in training and what they were told they had to say they didn't work.
Mm.
Therefore, it was okay to massage the figures. And my work now, which is in social care, which is after 5 years of restraint reduction, supposedly has been described as a crisis area for the health and safety executive because of the number of injuries. And it's the same thing. It's these incentives. If there are perverse incentives for managers to not be honest about what's happening, and for training not to be honest, if we're all having to pretend, use euphemisms to disguise it, then you open up the way for this to go wrong. And that's been the pattern. I think openness and transparency are the key.
Absolutely, yeah. I think the thing that strikes me is that I think Andy and I have discussed in the past that we both have an interest in an author called Philip Zimbardo. He was a scientist who carried out the research called the Stanford Prison Experiment, which at its heart explored the issue of power imbalances in these kinds of environments. And, he identified almost by accident, because the Stanford Prison Experiment wasn't supposed to be so clearly about those issues. It just had to be shut down after a number of days, because when they put a group of human beings very much identifiably in charge of another group of human beings with the ability to set the rules, with the ability to set their own behavioral standards, and without enough supervision to keep that on track, things degenerated so quickly that I think it shocked everybody involved, and they had to shut down this experiment. I mean, to give you the history, they opened up a basement in a university, and they designated that part of the university, that laboratory, if you like, as a prison, and they put, I think it was 20 or thereabouts individuals into it. Yeah. And split the group down the middle and said, you're now the prison officers and you're the prisoners. And within a very short space of time, the prison officers had decided that they they needed to identify the prisoners really clearly, so they had them shave their heads. And then they instigated a regime of isolation. If you didn't follow the rules, you couldn't eat at the same time as everybody else, and you were kept separate from everybody else. And all of these things just started to emerge in this group of very normal people. And so they were selected by these scientists because they were very normal. They'd all been psychometrically tested beforehand, and they were only allowed into the experiment if they were very, very sort of average people. And yet, in an environment of low supervision, where it was hard to identify the individual and their behavior and their acts, and relate an action that was taken to a specific person, i.e., you call it de-individuation. Everybody's kind of anonymous, and there's poor supervision. All of a sudden, in a group of human beings, you start to get, and it's kind of well known now, you start to get these primal behaviors start to leak out and emerge. And it's been so surprising to me in my short career, 17 or so years, to watch these panorama exposés and see very clearly on screen the anonymity of the staff who are working in these environments, and then the lack of supervision is so clear. I think even in Winterbourne View, Bernard, you might remember, you see the manager actually on the floor walking around. And I think in this most recent school example, you see the head teacher in the room while one of the members of staff is drawing, rude pictures on a child's face and neck. And the feeling you get watching that is that they are not intervening. They're not correcting the staff's behavior. They're not setting high expectations of professionalism. And we know, looking at that that's exactly how these poor cultures emerge. And it has, to my mind, little enough to do with what's going on in the training room and everything to do with what's going on in almost every encounter, every staff meeting, every review, and so on that's happening. And it's massively a supervision issue, if you ask me.
And that's absolutely right. And it's also modeling, because we saw the CEO of the company driving the school minibus, being interviewed while he was also on the phone. And if you do that in front of your staff, you give them permission for all the staff to do that. What I had recently is a member of staff who was under pressure to demonstrate that they weren't using real restraint, necessary restraint. And therefore, to do that, they changed the language they were using. And they was disguising the language, these euphemisms. And there was a clip in that film, which is in Panorama, about them saying what we'd say happened. We'd say that I was guiding him when in fact he dragged him up by the neck. And again, if managers see something and don't do anything about it, that's a signal to everybody else that whatever the explicit policies are, our implicit policies are, that's what we do here. I think if I was going to say what's the key learned from all of this over all of these years, it is, why do we have to wait for undercover reporters from Panorama to expose this every time? Because these guys aren't experienced. Having worked with them, you can't put experienced journalists out there because they could be swatted and said, "Oh, I've seen him from the telly." So what they are is normally students or straight out of university who have no actual background in this work, who get a brief bit of training and then they're wired up with mics and cameras. Now, if that is so good at exposing this, why are we waiting for Panorama? Why isn't this built into the system? Why is this not replacing some of the regulators? You seem to be very obvious.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a couple of bits that both of you mentioned there. So one, I think there's a deeper context, a Stanford Prison Experiment as well, that's quite interesting, that kind of explains this. When you look at the research afterwards, there were certain individuals that kind of went, well, I was filling a role. I thought that's what I was supposed to do. They were justifying their actions in advance of what they were doing. And it was definitely then they created that culture. You had this then authority and subordinate. The big thing with the Stanford Prison Experiment, which takes it deeper, it wasn't just the prison officers that fell into the role of becoming the authority. There was also that role playing of the individuals who were subordinate, becoming subordinate, acting as that role, becoming more defiant, to then antagonize. And that's straight away what you're going to get with this culture, that it is the behavior of the staff that is going to trigger further what might be classed as negative behavior from the children. And the big thing that you mentioned there, as far as the head teacher coming in, one of the reflections that Zimbardo said about the whole experiment, that he made a huge mistake, is he put himself in position of prison warden. And when one of the individuals came to him and said, I don't like this, I want to leave, I don't want to be part of the experiment, this doesn't feel right, because he was prison warden and he was too close to it, he ended up persuading this guy to stay and continue to experience this abuse and harassment. And that's where Zimbardo recognized later he was so part of it, he couldn't see the wood for the trees, he couldn't see it because he was too close. And that's what leads to what you said there, Bernard, as far as, why are people doing this? And I've just been involved in some stuff around safety monitoring, but it's predominantly looking at the dementia care homes, as far as, it's CCTV, but that's the old mentality of somebody in a room looking at TV monitors and stuff like that. And it's quite interesting what they're looking at doing to improve kind of best practice. And one of the things that they've kind of looked at, it isn't internally regulated, it's externally monitored. So the information set out to professionals safeguarding to within this particular organization, they do it to nurses or to social workers who take snippets of footage and just analyze, kind of do random samples, and then they kind of then look at, was there good practice, poor practice, really poor practice, or something really positive as well, which I quite liked. So they're actually then helping to adjust that culture to kind of go, we're recognizing the good and rewarding the good, but also then kind of there's an element of they never know when the cameras are and aren't watching. So there's a that prevents those negative behaviors or reduces them significantly. But then there is this balance of privacy and dignity in there, so which is quite interesting. Is that what kind of you were alluding to there, Bernard, as far as the safety?
Yes, the idea that there are ways of exposing this, and we seem to wait every 5 years for BBC to do it. The one which was routinely. I think we can learn a lot from other industries too, that have invested more money into trying to stop bad things happening. In the airline industry, for instance, they've got a system of anonymous reporting where flight deck crew, when things go wrong, have a way of reporting it so others can learn from it without it triggering an investigation on it, or there's no need to give names. And it would be useful, I think, for some central place where someone who works somewhere could just say, I'm not happy about what's happening here. And describe what's happening. And then it's up to somebody to check. I'd also say, given that the inexperienced young journalists can come into these places and they're not part of the current system, go home the first night and report their thoughts. Why couldn't have a system, people who want to come into this work from the university or even part of the university, would be maybe more useful for me than some of my teaching practice all these years ago, to have been given the task of working in several places and then commenting and feeding back how it compares with what people being told. What we keep exposing some of it.
Yeah,
I love that idea, Bernard, and certainly, it's, when we're all trainers of one kind or another, we have that role. One of the things that we've done with clients is suggested that they have, we've installed sort of QR codes around the facility or the service where the staff can anonymously, if they choose, report that they've been involved in or they've seen behavior of any kind by anybody, which makes them feel uncomfortable at least. And the training team, the trainers that we developed, had access to those reports as they came in, and they were tasked with going to that person if they were identified, or going to that team if the person was anonymous, and raising the issue and saying, look, we had an incident last week and somebody's reported they weren't comfortable with what they saw. And that could be a behavior from a service user, a client, a child, person in the service, or it could have been something a visitor did, or of course it could be something that one of the team did. In my experience, like, one of the most powerful things we can do in the training room actually is, and you'll get to know a little bit about me, but we're all about practicing these scenarios. And what we do is we practice something called ethical interventions. So we actually practice a scenario that says, your colleague is doing something that's going to get everybody in trouble, not just them, but if you're present and your colleague is doing something they shouldn't, you're there, you're present too. And so you're going to be complicit or you're going to do something about it. Now let's practice the different ways that you can say to this person, I'm here, I'm seeing what you're doing, and it's not acceptable to me, and we're going to have to write a report about what's going on. And we actually practice and talk about that in the training room in such a way that it becomes an expectation, because we've practiced it and it's in the training program, that if you see somebody doing something that is not ethical, let's say, that you are duty bound to do something there and then, to highlight it and say, I see you, I see what's happening, and this is not the right thing to do. And I think reflecting on the panoramas, those interventions are not happening in cultures that are failing. And of course, there's many reasons for that, power structures and so on. But that is one of the ways to I think, to that we can, in the training room, help to improve cultures in these services.
Going back to your Stanford Prison Experiment, it was actually interesting catch up on that, where as part of the BBC program, they tried to replicate the experiment. But the world's changed for psychologists. They call it the golden age of psychology, when they could go around electrocuting students for their research. And there's all sorts of ethics that prevent you doing. You couldn't do that experiment now, but they attempted to do it with various controls, which were mainly that the warders weren't allowed to abuse the things in the way they did in that experiment. And what was interesting in that was they had to stop that as well, as a matter of health and safety. But this time the roles are reversed. The people, and again, they were a representative sample, as you said, Gerard, but the people who got the role of prisoners, because they knew that the staff didn't actually have any authority over them at all, they started abusing the people in the role of warders, and it turned into exactly the same animal dominance subservience model. And I think that's a warning for us. We've tried often as a response to the horror that was at this program. People will say, well, we've just got to stop this and disempower all the staff. But when there's no structure at all, some young people who don't have self-control and self-regulation become terribly excited and distressed at the same time. And if you have ever seen a school that's fallen apart in a really rapid period of time because everyone lost authority and all the rules disappeared, you realise it's these simplistic answers aren't the right way to go. As you said, there's constructive ways of improving training. And I think we've been diverted sometimes in the last decade by campaigns that are misconstrued.
Very much so, yeah. I was talking with one of my trainers the other day, and he said, because we were talking about cultures in schools and so on, he said, you can tell very quickly. I was going to ask Andy this question actually about, as a private training provider, a company in this space, and of course we know one of our colleagues has been named, if you like, as part of what happened in Liverpool in the most recent panorama. But as a training provider, you have to be very sensitive to the culture in which you're going into, because we're external. We've got to try and figure out what's going on. But I was talking with one of my trainers recently, and he said he arrived at a school somewhere in England, and as he was pulling up to the school and starting to think about his training day, he noticed, as he looked around in the car park, that the staff at the school were taking their breaks in the car, in their own car. So he looked around, and there was people listening to the radio. They were having their cup of tea in their car. They were eating their snack or whatever in the car, and this was very. I mean, it's the clearest signal you can get at the beginning of an engagement that there's something not quite going right here about leadership, about how safe people feel, about their relationships with each other and so on. And I guess I was going to ask you this, Andy, because I know we have discussions about this internally quite a bit. Is, as a training provider, you have to put up we call it the red velvet rope, about our clients. And you must see this, and you work in care environments quite a lot, that you may have somebody inquire with you about doing training in physical interventions. And as you engage with them, you get a sense maybe that all is not well culturally in the organization. And it's a difficult position to be in, because you have to maybe sack the client, so to speak.
Yeah, I've had a few situations with that. As far as culturally, from some customers, we find their attitude towards physical intervention is sometimes the box ticking exercise is one of the things that I find most frustrating, and probably, I think, unfortunately, the education system is actually the worst for that. As far as we've got one inset day, please can you come and teach us physical intervention training for 40 staff in the morning, and then that's it. That's all they're interested in. So that can be really frustrating, and that's where we've lost customers going, no, as simple as that, because that straight away is an indication that that's not the kind of culture we want to work in. Yes, I remember one situation we had where it was actually within an organisation when we were delivering the training. So one of my more experienced trainers got a phone call from them, and he just said, "There's something wrong with the culture here. The staff are being incredibly antagonistic. They're questioning everything. There was just something wrong as far as the training is concerned." And what we got to the bottom of, the staff were being asked to do something that they felt uncomfortable with. To cut a long story short, basically they were being stipulated of how long they should be restraining this lad for. So if he goes into a behaviour, he's to be held for half an hour. If he doesn't calm down within half an hour, he's to be held for another half an hour. The staff had ended up holding this lad for like an hour and a half or something, and ended up calling the police. The police were not supportive. They were then kind of unhappy about being called, saying you should be dealing with this. So then the staff have been told they're not allowed to call the police. So, the staff were actually genuinely good people. They really were struggling with it. They just felt like they had their hands tied completely. And I think they wanted somebody to come in externally and kind of go, hey, this is not okay. This doesn't, you can't be doing this. We ended up whistleblowing on that particular customer, and they got investigated as a result. But, and that's not an easy thing to do for a training provider, but, it's that value structure being more important than anything else. But I think there is that not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do. And you saw that in the Panorama program, didn't you, with the particular lady who came and intervened in the situation and de-escalated it, and then was talking about, I know that's not right, but what are you going to do? And you could tell she felt very, very helpless in that particular situation to be able to make any change within the organization.
That's right. On the back of that, the head teacher brought the Panorama investigator into an office and said, I'm paraphrasing, your approach is really good. It's exactly what we're looking for. And it's not like the rest of the guys who are managing the kids. And you think to yourself, well, you're in charge.
She said some of the staff get a bit eggy with them.
That's right.
It's fascinating, this bit about the lack of duty of candor, as we say, the lack of honesty in the whole system. The job descriptions of these guys, the behaviour support mentor, and the mental health. And if you watched all these different terminologies and just watched them behaving, they were identical. It was a bit like a mafia gang, the way that the culture around there. And again, it's this bit about honesty, I think, is at the core of this, that we've got to give staff the confidence to tell the truth. And that's easier said than done sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think listening to you, Bernard, with your experience of running these kinds of services and as a head teacher, you've mentioned in this chat we've had today many times the words. And I think when we look at how you build a team, books like the Culture Code and so on, this idea of shared vocabulary is very important. But I guess the words have to mean something very specific. And everybody has to have a shared understanding of what the words mean when we say dignity, when we say respect, when we say necessary. These all have specific meaning. And if that starts to get corrupted, I think you're on a slippery slope, right?
You're absolutely right. And what's happened in an attempt to skate around the realities of this, because this is an area that everybody feels uncomfortable with, you've ended up with euphemisms describing almost everything that needs to be precise. I wrote about this in 1998, the meaning of last resort. That doesn't mean you have to try everything that hasn't got a hope in hell of succeeding before you do something effective. And what necessary means and what immediate means. Immediate doesn't mean that you have to be at risk of dying at this moment. It means you need to take immediate action now. And again, we tend to go swing from one extreme to the other with the reaction to everything going wrong, as we've seen here, is often just stop all of this, ban everything. And then it goes the other way when everybody's out of control and you've got really distressed youngsters. And then there's everybody, and you can see you get then the calls for we need more discipline, we need more, these schools need to control the children again. And somewhere in the middle is the right place to be. But we won't get there if we're using language deliberately to obfuscate. I've probably seen more incident records in the last decade than I ever saw in my career when I was being effective and doing something useful. But it's fascinating how meaningless some of those records are. They look very impressive, and there's pages and pages of risk assessments and behavior management plans and positive behavior support plans. But the content is tiny. And I think there's a risk of us doing these performances. And that's when the good staff lose confidence and go and sit in their cars at break times. I've got to say, though, I don't know about you, but I mean, I doubt myself when I see these programs. You know, there's every time there's one of these scandals, I think back to situations with youngsters that I messed up. And if I'm honest, I'll say I'm glad there wasn't a video recording that. But perhaps what we need is a culture that allows people to make mistakes, the good people, and supports them and lets them survive, because that's a problem too, that it's very easy to scapegoat, and we scapegoat the wrong people. I think back to what can we do, as well as getting youngsters out of college, perhaps, to be some structured way of getting better feedback. What I did when I'd lost confidence, actually, was went and interviewed youngsters. I've got interviews from children themselves from the early 2000s, but with all of the confidentiality issues, these were troubled youngsters, and many of them were in care. So I couldn't use this. I wanted to use it in training in a way, because sometimes asking young children, how should people manage? What do you think we should do here? Help us. What's the best way? And they've got a lot of insight, but I couldn't show it. But I also look to these online forums, to all the schools I've run, just to see, how was this happening in my school? Because we're criticizing the management here, and it's always the management's responsibility. But I'm sure there are managers who discover things going on in their own organizations and are genuinely horrified. They've been thinking, why couldn't I have found out this? How could this be kept from me? And it's reassuring looking at some of the forums for youngsters who've come out of our systems and are now middle-aged men, some of them. And they say that, they remember their school days. For instance, I can see one outcome of the Panorama program we've just seen. This was supposedly a sports college. And they said it's easy to deal with these youngsters because you just have to make it fun. But there actually is something in that making it fun is quite an important way in to kids who are completely switched off education. And many of the best colleagues I've ever worked with were ex-sports people and ex-professional rugby players and semi-professional footballers. And these are the people that the youngsters remember as changing their lives. I've got a friend of mine who taught Frank Bruno to box in school like this. And I think it's important, again, we don't chuck the baby away with the bathwater here. Interviewing children, if there was a way of doing this and sharing that, is a great way in training of getting the message over. People will listen to children saying exactly what we told them, and they'll go, oh, that's so true, when they hear a youngster say it, whereas they rejected it when we did. And what I was fortunate to do 2 years ago, I'd filmed in, not my school, a school with a very good head teacher of very troubled youngsters. I'd filmed a lot of these interviews with these youngsters back then that didn't have any permissions to use them. But with our internet now, we managed to trace a group of them who are now young adults. And I gathered them together and we watched the videos of them as kids, which they loved, but also their explanations of difficult issues like physical restraint and why it was necessary and what we ought to do. But also then had a round table with all these now young ladies and young men who were parents themselves, talking about their own parenting and what they thought. Now, if there's a way of, again, getting that into the system so that that could be used as training, I think that would be very valuable, and it's very good feedback for policymakers. But we sort of hamstrung a bit over the data bits. I think it would be better if we adopted the language of health and safety, because ultimately, when things go wrong, when I'm in court, it's about health and safety. It's about breaches of management of health and safety at work regulations when people get injured, or breaches of duty of care under the Children Act or the Mental Health Act. And I think for many of the people who work in these areas, and I think it's important we don't forget them, that there are people being battered on a daily basis in social care settings. And this is work-related violence. I've had reports from psychiatrists who were objecting to the use of the word violence because violence implies intent, and I understand that. But that's not the definition of the health and safety executive. It's simply if you're getting injured and hospitalised as a result of the behaviour of other humans, then that's violence as far as I'm concerned.
I had exactly the same thing. I was speaking within the dementia remit. I did a talk down at a summit down in London, and I did my talk on violence in care, and I got so much kind of negativity, or a few people commenting going, it's not violence, it's distress. And I tried to get over in my talk, like, please don't misunderstand me. In no way am I condemning or judging the individuals who are displaying this behaviour. But if I get punched in the face, that is violence. And I have a right not to have violence inflicted on me. That's one of my basic human rights. And there's a separation, isn't there? It's the behaviour that I'm receiving versus the intent of the behaviour that's being displayed. Verbal violence, exactly the same. I don't think people always, in that violence category, people don't always think about the verbal and unwanted attention and constant harassment and things like that, and bullying under the violence remit as well. And
distress is a very good example of a euphemism that's taken the social care industry by storm.
Yes,
it's based on everyone's got a theory of behaviour, even those who don't think they've got one. In that program we saw, their theory was that if you bullied these kids enough, they'd learn their place and they'd learn to behave. And that, unfortunately, is a sort of intuitive way of thinking to people who don't know much about it. I mean, it's very common. But the idea that hazardous behaviour is always the result of distress is actually quite embedded, and it's simply not true. It is true for many people with autism and severe learning disabilities. And if you can do something to reduce the pressures on people so they don't become distressed, obviously that's what we're trying to do. That's the essence of positive behaviour support, although that itself has become a meaningless euphemism to describe anything good as opposed to anything bad on the one hand, but on the other as a particular brand for a package that has no evidentiary base at all. And I spoke with some people actually involved in restraint reduction initiatives in Brisbane last year on this, and we actually all agreed. And it was interesting having an honest conversation like this, that we all agreed that it was cultures that was the issue, and that some of the things that we've been teaching just didn't work. Excuse me, I'll stay with this.
That's right.
But there's some behaviour that is distressed. There's also some behaviour which is predatory behaviour, which is people who've learned to get what they want by bullying, and we've seen staff doing that. But there are some young people who I work with who learned that way. And the important thing is we need to teach them better ways of getting what they want. But we also need to teach them self-restraint, and there is some teaching needs to go into that. The idea that if you remove all the pressure, you'll get no problem. I often think when I listen to some psychologists lecturing at conferences, why don't you just try this technique? Just go and try and talk to the Taliban about this and see how far you get by taking pressure off. There are times when you've got to teach people things, and these are unpopular views sometimes. But again, we're back to transparency and honesty. We need an honest conversation.
So that's quite an interesting kind of topic, and maybe there's a whole other round table, maybe. So is your preferred term hazardous behaviour, Bernard? Is that the one you feel that most fits for, especially around behaviour that requires restraint?
In my expert witness word, that's what I use all the time, and it's found favour with judges. because it's clear. It's not blaming anybody.
Yeah.
The behavior is hazardous if it fits within the framework of the duty of an employer under management of health and safety at work is that they must assess the hazards. And for most of the people working with the sort of the industries that we're interested in, or I am mainly, the hazard is the behavior of the people that let it be after.
Yeah. I still challenging behavior has fallen out of favor. I find behaviors of concern doesn't really hit it with enough emphasis for me. I tend to use
reactions of the staff, aren't they?
Yes.
Challenging behavior has nothing to do with behavior. It's how I feel about it.
Yeah.
Behavior is concerned.
Yeah, absolutely.
That doesn't mean there's not a problem.
No. I do prefer behaviour that challenges to describe kind of all behaviour perception of. Maladaptive behaviour is one that I tend to refer to as well. But hazardous behaviour is my preferred if we're getting to the realm of having to physically intervene, because that then puts it in, there's something hazardous. That's why I'm doing it. So I agree with that. Have you got any different opinion on that, Gerard?
Yeah, I think we're all, over a period of time, we all seek out various phrases that tease out the right emphasis, isn't it? That we want when we're speaking to our clients. I think at the early part of this conversation, Andy, we talked about how we have to educate our clients often about this topic. They know they want it or need it, but they often don't have a detailed understanding. That's why they need us, and so we educate them. So, I have started to use, terms like vulnerable and volatile for conflict management scenarios where, volatile and unpredictable behaviors, I think is important to talk about that. And for sure, there is a sensitivity about what I might refer to as physical confrontations, because we are trying to gently encourage our clients to listen to us about these topics. So we have to have these slightly gentler phrases to open the conversation up until we can say the word violence. And I love, Bernard, how you said there are staff getting battered and there are staff who are getting brutalized. And this affects them, their careers, their lives, their family lives. And it is important to be able to speak in true terms about what effects that has on them in environments where we have vulnerable people who are unpredictable. And I'm sure let's table a sticky note to come back to this over the years, perhaps, and let's see if we can find a phrase that works. But I do like hazardous behavior. I think it's the Ron Seal rule, I guess. It is. It says on the tin. Hazardous behavior.
I was doing useful work. I think 90% of what I was actually doing was mood management. So I think that's a term that covers an awful lot. And that's about you can call it positive behavior support, or you can call it preventive stress behavior. Managing moods is not just about calming people down. It's about sometimes exciting them, giving them some purpose. If you ask the youngsters, what do you remember about the kids that really say it was the best day of their lives, they sometimes remember things I'm not sure I want to tell you we did. Fun things. Do you remember when you climbed up that cliff? Things like that. Well, I'm not saying that. So we're back to safeguarding and hazards. And I don't think this is a separate idea. I think safeguarding, we had that Singapore Airlines thing in May. You had 21 people hospitalized because at the airline being sued now for a lot of money because they weren't restrained. Now you could argue that talk about human rights and say that there's no reason why they should be restrained. There was no imminent risk. I've seen someone in business class arguing furiously with the cabin crew about being made to wear a shoulder harness, arguing that it's right to just have a seatbelt when the economy have only got seatbelts, missing the point that it's the shoulder belts there because you have to put a chair in front of you to protect me. But it's that framework. But if we hazardous behavior and safeguarding and get the idea that what we're doing is trying to improve the mood and cheer people up and give people some fun and excitement, but also look like you can safe at the same time. And these aren't separate ideas, it's part of the same process.
I've actually got your book, Bernard, Mood Management by Bernard Allen. So yeah, it's on my bookshelf. You got it as well, Gerard.
Also,
Whether you've only sold two.
I do love that idea though, and I have had a discussion with a professional colleague of mine who's a specialist in autism and learning disabilities and so on. And we talk about in the program that I teach, reduce stimulation as part of a crisis management approach. And I had this discussion with him. I said, I think we need to talk about appropriate stimulation. And I think I had Bernard's voice in the back of my head saying, there are times where we need to, again, you read the work of in the Culture Code and the talent. What was that book called? But the concept is ignition. We need to ignite something into the children. They need to have a positive goal to work towards, not just ways of being quieter, ways of sitting more still, ways of doing what they're told. I mean, what kind of society will we have? I mean, back in the day, a lot of these kids would have been Royal Marines or something, because they love climbing cliffs and jumping off things and blowing things up, and that's all positive.
An article. It was from New Zealand, I think. It was from a school that they were having some construction work done. And rather than what they usually do is cordon it off, they actually let the children involve the construction area as part of their play. I don't know whether you've come across this before. But the children, they actually found a reduction in accidents because the children were starting to learn risk assessment themselves, and so they found a reduction in accidents, but they found the level of concentration and the ability to sit still in the children after break times was significant. Because if you're having to walk this tightrope of emotional and mood modulation for an entire day, you're gonna burn out. It's too hard. So suddenly you've got these opportunities to actually burn off some energy and explore and just lift your mood, engage with the environment. Well, straight away there's positive outcomes as a result of that. But it's that fear of got to stop them from ever getting hurt.
I thought it was great. I was torn watching that because he had planks of wood and nails sticking out. And and there was a stage where this head teacher in an interview, and he walked past the kid who was up a tree, hanging out of a tree. And the kid's like, help, help, help. And he just said, well, you should have climbed up there and carried on walking. I was very...
It's counted to everything.
I'm counted to everything I thought I knew. So, yes. I think the excitement, I think there's optimum excitement levels. And my heart plummets when I read some documents from, I'm not blaming any particular sector, but there are some social care homes for people with severe learning difficulties where the culture seems to be that a good shift is a shift that was quiet. So if nothing happens, good shift, and everyone's just sitting quietly doing nothing. And you sometimes see day rooms that are a bit like that. And you ask the clients, and they want a bit of fun. I've got a case at the moment who's a youngster who needs a helmet. And he's communicating that he needs nothing else will reduce the stress other than banging his own head until it subsides. That's no use just saying you can't do that. You've got to give alternatives, but you've also, if you haven't got an alternative that's effective, you've got to get involved in safeguarding. We're back to that balance again, and it's not one or the other. We've got to keep people safe, and we want to give them a bit of excitement and fun, and part of that is taking risks. But optimal excitement levels. There are times, I spend most of my time when I'm not working trying to raise my arousal level, not reduce it. And there is an optimal level of excitement. Sort of excited anticipation is a great mental state to be in. If you're too excited or too distressed, you can't think clearly. It's sometimes fun to be excited, though. We've all had silly evenings where we behave stupidly, and that's fun too. And so again, this idea, there's a sort of cult, there's an explanation of behavior that says all behavior is caused by over-arousal, and all we need to do is reduce everyone's arousal. I'm saying that's not quality of life. In fact, there's a bit of research published last year on research on all of the evidence about the sort of things we're doing to promote positive daily support, which basically said that it's not, there's no evidence that in a lot of these cases it's helping quality of life. And we agreed, this is the conference last year, that we should be focusing on actively working to improve quality of life. People say, well, you do it.
Yeah. It kind of leads back to you said about talking to the children as well. I had a really interesting conversation with a primary school teacher on one of my podcasts. She uses restorative practice predominantly within her school, so very much what the youth justice system uses and things like that. So they have no punishment, they have no reward, they have no praise, they only give feedback. But one of the interesting things that was kind of happened is that they spoke to the kids about this. They did interview the kids as part of the process. And the kids were the ones telling them going, so I think they had like hero of the week and stuff like that. And the kids are the ones who fed back going, well, it's just turn taking though, isn't it? And they're the ones who called out this praise response that going, well, I'll get my time because the teacher just slowly works around the room. So it's like, as you said, learning from the children themselves is a huge part of the culture. There's two other things I just wanted to, as we draw it back to culture. One is that I've worked in care systems, and I know in some of the schools, like getting hit is just part of the job. As I've heard that numerous times, and I always try and put that over, going, well, getting a splinter is just part of being a carpenter, but losing your hand shouldn't be. And there's an acceptable level of risk to every job, but it shouldn't just be a case of, well, that is accepted no matter what, as kind of a big part of that, isn't it? That is, as we spoke about, the violence towards the staff is significant. But the same as yourself, Bernard, I've come across the good shift, which is the quiet one. And I've heard staff kind of going, oh, how was yesterday? I was all right. I essentially, kids stayed in the room all day and I got to sit on my ass and do nothing, essentially. And they consider that to be a good shift. As you said, it's like, what's the point in you? We could do that with CCTV. You know, that's all you are is a glorified nanny cam. So where's the engagement? Where's the positive interaction? Where's the promoting of socialization and putting pressure on the kids to go and do something outside and engage and stuff like that, as you kind of mentioned?
That's
and that
right.
all pulls back to that culture, doesn't it?
And if we pull back far enough, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. There's a recruitment and selection and retention issue that we can't really ignore. I know a lot of my clients are struggling to get people, bodies in the door, not to mention the right characters, not to mention the right approaches, the right values base. And that's we have to, I think, acknowledge simply that's a real challenge for people. And it's not great because we'll get those people, won't we, Andy, who just clock watch and they don't really care about the people they're looking after. They're in the care sector or they're doing teaching support because somebody else they know got that job and they got walked in, and maybe they're not the right person for this job. And yet, I guess, and Bernard, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this. When you're leading a school, you need to have cover. That word that I hate. We've got that covered. Well, covered how? At what level of quality? And there's no easy answers to that, I'm sure.
I don't look back with that honestly, though, because one of the outcomes of attempts to prevent the sort of thing that we're dealing with here from happening is then perverse incentives for employers. If you tell an employer that it's good practice to reduce training to prevent people from getting involved in behavior management, then you'll get some people straight away see that there's a cost saving there. And then there's two ways in doing this. They say that if we tell all the staff they're not to intervene at all in any incidents, then we don't need to train them to do that, which is a big saving, and there won't be any incidents that get filmed, so we won't get in trouble. That seems like an easy win. But it's a perverse incentive because then you don't pay for the training. You say that the staff are only expected to supervise, and if any behaviour management's needed, you delegate it to other authorities. So you call the police, or you get a security guard in to do it, and that justifies reducing the staffing levels, because some of the biggest costs in social care are if you've got to have one-to-one staffing on a contract, or two-to-one staffing. That's a lot. But the reason for that staffing level is often that some people are expected to intervene to protect people. And if we're told we don't intervene, walk away, then we don't need that level of staffing. I've seen that sort of thing crawl in, and that also combines with the perverse incentive to demonstrate that we are reducing interventions, where you get the managers then, in one case, filling in all the incident reports herself and rewriting what happened, really. And it's this bit by bit, you think, how can this happen? And we're back to this culture. It's the whole culture's polluted here by a lack of clarity and a lack of honesty.
Untruths.
Tell the truth.
Yeah, I like your point earlier, Bernard, about allowing people to make mistakes, and I think that's maybe it goes a little bit deeper than the culture of the organisation, doesn't it? As far as expanding on that, and I always sort of say, the staff should be role modelling the behaviour they want, and to change behaviour, yes, you can use punishment, reward, and stuff like that, but inspiration is a better way of motivating people towards change. But if the staff are uninspired, then how are they supposed to then inspire anybody else? So it comes from the top of that point. But if the pressure on is that we're looking to make sure you're ticking a box as far as your outcomes are concerned, whatever those outcomes or expectations are, well, that's immediately uninspiring. So because it takes that away. So you've got this systemic kind of problem as far as, and I think in care especially, and you'll probably find, you guys work in schools an awful lot more than I do, but in care particularly, it's a very, very easy job to get, but it's an incredibly challenging job to do. But there is no kind of value given. And if you feel undervalued, then why would you look to inspire anybody as well? And that kind of leads through the whole process. And I'm sure that's very much in schools as it is in the health and social care sector to generally.
I think Gerard was right about the importance of scenario training. I've always been an advocate of scenario training. But I think it's also a good mentality to admit to staff that we're all acting here. This isn't real. And I've got more confidence in a member of staff who can admit that this youngster really winds me up. And I would have never known. And because I think when people say, "Oh, I'm a caring person," sometimes they don't have a lot of self-awareness. There are days when we don't want to go to work, all of us, and I think we should say that to people and say, "But the job it's an acting job, and them from the minute you cross the threshold, I mean, your life may be falling apart. In your car, sort your makeup out, get ready, and then you're on stage. And it's like being a stand-up comedian sometimes, and more than it ought to be sometimes. But the thing is, it's an act. The fact that you're miserable has no impact on how you perform that night. Otherwise, you're out of a job. You've got to step on stage and become a character. And I think people need to know that every moment they're out on the stage there, particularly the leadership team, no model it. If you're driving the minibus and on the phone and saying this little kid is a shit or something like that, which we heard, and that's the performance now that is part of our culture.
Yeah.
So it's everyone's job to model.
That's right. And I think, this is a bigger thing. First of all, we call that the showtime mindset. So we use this idea of the showtime because it literally conveys this idea of there is a stage. And if there's a stage and you're on it, that means there's backstage. And backstage is very important for staff. Yeah. And it shouldn't be their own car in the car park. It needs to be a physical place, but also an emotional space they go to. But if you're on stage, there's an audience. And I think that speaks, Andy, to this idea of the CCTV monitoring, which is a hugely interesting area. And then when we understand that it's a performance occupation, we can practice for it because every actor practices their lines. And they have, to an extent, a script. They know what they're supposed to be saying, let's say. And I think when we do that in the training room, we set the expectation. But I think and we're talking about cultures, the old phrase is that culture beats strategy. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Is that the right phrase? So it's after we leave the training room that it's the CEO, that head teacher, how the SLT behave with the staff will set a model for how the staff then behave with the children and the parents if we're talking about schools. So we can't say it enough, can we, Bernard? It comes from the top. And it's about how it's modeled. Yeah, it's so important.
It improves your own mental health as well. If you get into the act, sometimes you forget that you're miserable.
Well, smiling actually has been demonstrated that it significantly improves your mood just by smiling. Sticking a pen in your mouth. Just made me happier. It didn't. Psychology says that does. 100%. And I think I often refer to that no matter what it is, health and social care or education, it is a customer service business. But I say it's not the customer's always right mentality, but the same as you'd expect a person behind the counter to put on the act. But that leads us into that's then going into a big thing for me, which is professional boundaries. And that's maybe a whole topic for another time, because I think that's a really important thing, that you see the boundaries aren't there. The professional boundaries aren't there, and that's all the showtime. I am not here. I'm here for you. You're not here for me. Kind of mentality that needs to happen. But as you said, but I need that space to be able to walk away. Sometimes I go, oh, that kid is really winding me up. It's okay to feel that way, but then it's going, there's no judgment, no blame. And that should always be post-incident. Again, it's that role modeling. If I'm engaged in an incident, post-reflection, there should be no criticism and no blame. If we're expecting to not blame the kids and not criticize the kids and make the kids to feel valued, well, that needs to happen exactly the same to the staff when they make a mistake. This is a learning curve. We didn't do it quite right. We need to do better. Let's reflect on. There's no judgment. There's no blame. There's no criticism. Let's just be better for next time. Mistakes should always be stepping stones in learning, not just opportunities to condemn. And I think that's where a lot of staff don't always report things, because they feel, I'll get in trouble. I didn't do it perfect, so they'll think I'm not a good member of staff. And again, that's cultural across the board, isn't it? As far as from the top, as I say, beyond the top, I think, as far as the local authority then putting that pressure on from external as well. We've got a long way to go, haven't we? As far as we can make our little differences in our training courses and stuff like that, but there is a soapbox that needs to be got on, and hopefully as the ICM, if we can keep building momentum and keep having our voices that do look at it in a very rational point of view and kind of from the hazard analysis rather than the knee-jerk reaction and the emotional effect of just we must protect this one particular group, that we must protect everybody, I think is where hopefully the ICM, and why I joined the ICM rather than others to start off with, because that's what I saw in the ICM's kind of brand and model. And I think you guys are exactly the same. I know that Bernard, obviously you've been with the ICM for a long time and been a big advocator of it, haven't you?
I haven't actually. I'm a recent
convert.
John, but I agree. They say that having a sense of purpose is one of the most important things for your own mental health. And for a purpose, aren't we?
Yes.
And it's easy to do. It's possible to do.
Yeah. We just need to get in front of the right people and slowly work our way up the chain and get in those right rooms again. Which I know
this is a good opportunity to guide them in the right direction.
Great conversation.
Yeah.
Good conversation.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you both. I think there's about 1,000 conversations that we could trigger off from this particular roundtable. So we'll definitely get our heads together and have discussion of what other things and other topics that we could talk about. But
have fun in
Trinidad, yes, yeah. It's the weekend, so. We've been told we need to go to the beach and eat something called doubles, which is the local delicacy here from a street food vendor. We'll see how that works out.
Fantastic. Yes.
Great. I hope you guys have a great weekend. It's been great to talk with you.
See you all.
Thanks, guys.